Thank you. Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. Again, my name's Kevin Cheney, and I welcome you to today's webinar, which will feature work completed through a contract that I had the pleasure of managing with Apt Associates and Geisinger Health Systems beginning in 2010 called the Health IT Hazard Manager. This project just recently concluded, and the final report is hot off the press and available on ARC's Health IT website, so I encourage you all to go take a look. Today's presentation will focus on how the Health IT Hazard Manager was tested and refined, as well as potential strategies and implications for deploying it. I'm very pleased to welcome the PD, the Project Director and Project Manager for the Hazard Manager, Dr. Jim Walker and Ms. Andrea Hassel. Dr. Jim Walker designs care coordination and health IT systems that support safe and effective patient care. He is the Chief Health Information Officer of the Geisinger Health System, where he leads Geisinger's development of a fully integrated inpatient and outpatient EHR, a networked patient health record used by almost 200,000 patients, a health information exchange that serves 2.5 million patients, and the Keystone Beacon community. He leads ONC and ARC-funded studies on care coordination, health information exchange, and health IT safety. Dr. Walker is a member of the Health IT Standards Committee of HHS and chair of the committee's Clinical Quality Work Group. He's a member of the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics and consults regularly with NIH and IOM. He has published numerous peer-reviewed articles in a widely used book called Implementing an Electronic Health Record System. Dr. Walker earned his medical degree at the University of Pennsylvania before completing a residency in internal medicine at the Penn State Hershey Medical Center. Ms. Andrea Hassel is a principal associate at Apt Associates and directed the Hazard Manager beta test design, data collection, and analysis. Ms. Hassel has directed evaluations of telemedicine programs, health information exchange, secure messaging, and other health IT initiatives funded by ARC, ONC, and HRSA. Ms. Hassel works closely with Geisinger Health System. In addition to the Hazard Manager beta test, she currently assists in evaluating Geisinger's Keystone Beacon community and the Key High Health Information Exchange, and previously evaluated the Geisinger Online Patient Portal. I'd like to remind the audience that neither myself as the moderator nor any of the presenters have any conflicts of interest to disclose at this time. Again, I hope everyone finds today's presentation to be both informative and help us better understand the role a tool such as the Hazard Manager might play in the future for improving patient safety by prospectively capturing, monitoring, and resolving health IT hazards. As a reminder, we will have a Q&A session following the presentation, so feel free to submit your questions. Jim and Andrea, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I want to start by getting control of the slides. Today we want to talk about a tool that's designed to help care delivery organizations, health IT developers, and others, including regulators and policymakers, to make what are already safe systems, health IT, even safer. And I'd like to start with this quote from the eminent systems engineer Nancy Levison, who says that hazard analysis is accident analysis before the accident happens. What we want to talk about today is a tool that's designed to help organizations identify potential safety hazards associated with health IT and fix them before any patient is ever affected. So we'll talk some about theoretical and design considerations for the Hazard Manager, and then Andrea is going to demo version 2.0 of the Hazard Manager, which was the result of the beta test, talk a little bit about the beta test sites and procedures, some of the methods we used, the results we got during that beta test, and how the Hazard Manager was redesigned to its current version 2.0, and then some potential policy implications for all of this. I'm going to go on to this slide. This cartoon tries to set out the relationship of hazards and patient harm. If you note the three boxes up at the top, which have an error in health IT design or implementation, or an interaction between health IT and some other healthcare system, both of those can create hazards. And the question then becomes, is the hazard identified? Can the hazard be controlled? And if not, does the hazard trip up some user into some kind of error that might result in patient harm? This slide, which lost some of the arrows, is intended to suggest what hazard control is. If a hazard can be identified and resolved before it is ever in a production system, before it ever gets near to a patient, then obviously that hazard can't cause patient harm. And then the question is, if a hazard escapes all of that surveillance and actually does harm a patient, can we identify the hazard at that point, feed it back into the system, and go ahead and resolve it? So what we've tried to design is a tool that helps organizations and health IT developers identify hazards as early as possible in the life cycle and get them out of the system, and then also share that experience in a way that other care delivery organizations and other developers of health IT can learn from those experiences and create safer and safer systems. So I want to talk about just one example which I hope makes clear the importance of proactive hazard identification and control. This comes from Geisinger's experience when we were putting in a new order entry system, which is widely regarded as best in class. Our design teams were unable to create workflows that they felt were safe, connecting with our was also clearly best in class inpatient pharmacy system. As you can imagine, there was a great deal of hand-wringing and soul-searching, and we finally went to executive leadership and said, we need to rip out this state-of-the-art, beautifully implemented pharmacy system in the interest of patient safety, put in a new pharmacy system that is integrated with the order entry system. It cost several $100,000 and a 9-month delay in the project. Fortunately, the team had a track record and the executive team had a commitment to patient safety that made it possible for them to say, okay, go ahead and do all of that. It's probably obvious to you, we made all of that commitment and all of those changes without being certain that our concern about the safety of the interaction between those two applications was even valid. A couple of years later, we learned that David Klassen had studied more than 62 organizations and found that, or at least concluded, that it's never safe to have to try to interface an order entry system with a pharmacy system that was not made by the same company. And of course, that raises the question, how widely is this known, and are there still organizations out there buying non-integrated pharmacy and order entry systems? And so that's the kind of issue that the hazard manager is designed to help identify, but particularly help to make shareable with the rest of the healthcare sector in a way that's acceptable to the people that find these hazards. As you probably know, one of the problems with hazard control is that most organizations are afraid to publish the hazards they've found for fear that will reflect badly on them. So here's just a nice quote that I won't read to you. I'll let you take a moment to read it, but I think it sort of sums up nicely why it's so important that we do proactive hazard control. Granted the importance of trying to identify hazards, one of the things that is necessary if we're going to communicate them among each other effectively is to have a standard terminology or ontology for expressing hazards. Obviously, that will enable us to compare hazards, to learn from each other's experiences in reasonably efficient ways. And just as an example, much of the budget, which is a modest budget, but still much of the budget of the Aviation Safety Information Analysis and Sharing System that does beautiful work is actually taken up on standardizing reports from various airlines. And the reason for that is because every airline uses a different reporting language and at least feels like they can't afford to change their whole reporting system to use a single comparable language. And so one of our hopes is that we could create and test an ontology that would be usable and useful enough that it would save health IT from ending up in that same kind of quagmire several years down the road. So what we did at Geisinger is became aware of the fact that we were identifying lots of potential hazards, and actually had the experience of trying to share with a couple of other organizations a method for reporting those hazards, and concluded that everyone was afraid to even talk about hazards. So what we decided to do is try to develop a tool that would enable us to at least capture our own hazards in a consistent and comparable way. And we actually, in the alpha test, entered 266 hazards, almost none of which, perhaps none of which had actually reached a patient. And then, having done that work, said this would really be a lot more use to everyone if we were able to test it with other organizations, see to what extent the ontology could capture the range of hazards that other organizations found, and would make sense, be a usable language that people could really communicate effectively with. So having done the alpha test, we got together with Abt Associates and Andrea Hassel, and with ECRI, the patient safety organization, to create a website that we could use then for the beta test. And Andrea and I led the beta test evaluation, and also the attempt to turn that evaluation into a second improved version of the hazard manager and the ontology that underlies it. So one of the things we'll come back to, but one of the things we started with is that you can't possibly expect people to participate wholeheartedly and really effectively in this kind of hazard control system unless they receive real benefits from it, because there are obviously considerable costs just in time, let alone in perceived risk. And so what we designed is a system that was intended to serve care delivery organizations to let them manage their process, sort of know what the hazards they've identified, who's responsible for fixing it, what the timeline is, make it possible to really manage the hazards they find through to conclusion, and then learn about hazards that others have found in their product, particularly the same product that they use. For software vendors, we wanted to make it so that software vendors could learn about hazards that their customers don't explicitly or don't typically in the current system relate to them, and then learn about other products, other vendors' products that may be hazardous when paired with their own. So that one of the ideas we had in mind, obviously, was that a good hazard manager tool might enable us to identify things like the dangers of linking or trying to interface pharmacy and order entry systems. And then finally, for a whole set of people in number 3 there, let the healthcare sector as a whole be able to have some reliable evidence about how we're doing in identifying hazards and resolving them out of our systems. One of the things we wanted to do to make this possible was control security, or to say it differently, to protect everyone's confidentiality, so that care delivery organizations can enter hazards, view hazards, and see hazards associated with the products that they use, but not other hazards identified with other products that they don't have any interest in. The same way letting software vendors see all of the customers' hazards and the patterns of hazards related to other customers' products, and then all of us looking at all of the hazards in a de-identified way. So now Andrea is going to talk about, first, we thought it would be useful for you to see version 2 of the Hazard Manager, and then we're going to talk some about how we moved from version 1 to version 2.
Okay, thanks, Jim. This is a screenshot of the first screen of the Hazard Manager, and you'll see there are just 2 fields, and these in yellow is a short description. This is the only required field in the whole Hazard Manager, and it's important to notice that the yellow bar is a public field. So whatever a user enters here is viewable to all the other users of the Hazard Manager, and therefore you wouldn't want to enter any identifiable information about a patient, a clinician, a healthcare organization, or a vendor. During the test, we had, ECRI was checking to be sure none of that revealing information was entered in this public description. And then down below, there's space for a very detailed private description. Whatever a healthcare organization needs to keep track of as they work through a hazard, notes to each other on a team that's working on a hazard, resolution, any remaining issues. So it's almost an open scratch place to keep track of what's going on with a hazard. The short description is public again, and it's important to verify that no one identifies anything they shouldn't. The long description is private and is for the use of the healthcare organization only. The ontology Jim spoke about has 4 main components. Discovery is the first, when and how the hazard was discovered and in what stage of the life cycle. The causes of a hazard, which may be many, they can range from usability to data quality, vendor factors, user factors. The impact of a hazard. If you find a hazard before it's affected a care process, it hasn't yet impacted any patients, but if you don't find it until it's in production and has reached a patient, there may be harm. And finally, when it comes to time to control the hazard, what those control steps are and who will need to approve the control plan before it's implemented, and then who's responsible for the fix. This is the discovery screen. So you'll see there are several questions here: how the hazard was discovered, the stage of discovery, how long the hazard was present when it was discovered, and how the hazard was communicated or shared, either internally or reported to a vendor, or perhaps published or shared with a user group. In summary, these are the elements of the discovery part of the ontology. The next screen, and perhaps the most interesting, is causation. And you'll see there are 6 major categories of causation, and under each there are several attributes, causal attributes. So starting in the top left, usability. And these are things like difficult data entry and information that's hard to find or hard to understand. Going across the top, decision support issues, faulty recommendations generated by the decision support system, or inadequate clinical content. Local implementation issues on the top right are also common, and these are things that, particularly for organizations that do a lot of customization, there may be local issues, hazards that are introduced at the local level. On the bottom left, data quality, and this can be design related to the design, or it could be related to data being lost, faulty reference information. A lot of things can contribute to poor data quality. In the middle, vendor factors, things that are under the control or at least partial control of the vendor. And then on the right, other factors related to, often related to the organization, things like training or data security. So in version 2.0, these are the major categories, each of which has several attributes or causal factors. Next, we come to impact. And the first question the hazard manager asks is, has this hazard affected a care process? And if not, we next ask to estimate the potential that it could, and the potential that patients could be harmed if this hazard isn't controlled and gets into production. So the first question after saying that no, it hasn't affected a care process yet, is the risk that it could if it's not controlled, high, medium, low. If the hazard were to affect a care process, how likely is it that an end user, a clinician, would notice before a patient was harmed? And again, high, medium, low. Next is the best estimate of how many patients could be affected if this hazard isn't found. And we gave just 3 ranges to get a ballpark feeling for, is this likely to be a small a hazard that would impact very few patients, or one that would reach a lot of patients. And then finally, if it did reach a patient and cause harm, what would be the most serious harm that could happen? So again, if the hazard has not yet affected a care process, some estimation or prediction about what would happen if it did, if it were not controlled. If instead you said, yes, this hazard has affected a care process, we're now into the question of, and did it reach a patient, and if so, did it harm any patients? So we ask, did it reach a patient, and if it harmed someone, how bad was the harm? And what you see here is the ARC harm scale, which is, this is a revised iteration that ARC is in the process of testing, and that we felt made a lot of sense. So it asks, what was the most severe harm to a patient, ranging from unknown, because perhaps it isn't clear yet, all the way to patient death. How long was the harm to the patient? Was it temporary or long-term? And what type of harm? Most harm scales focus on physical harm, but we felt it was also important to call out psychological harm, financial harm to the patient, and certainly reputational harm when there's a data breach of some sort. So again, the cascade of questions, if yes, it affected a care process, did it reach a patient? If it reached a patient, was there harm? How much and what type of harm? Controlling a hazard, the hazard control plan, we asked first, how quickly must this be controlled? And there are several different options here. Sometimes a hazard is controlled immediately, and by the time you come to enter it, it's already been fixed, so there's no more action required. Occasionally, the decision is made not to control a hazard because the risks of doing something exceed the benefits.
An example of that, just because that may not be immediately apparent, would be the fact that some EHR products will enable you to have 4 or 5 patient records open at one time. That is probably fairly clearly not safe, and there have been some reports of problems associated with that. But in terms of the fix, you could imagine saying, well, okay, we're only going to let 1 patient record be open at once, but then someone might say, well, but what if a nurse comes in and needs an emergency order on 1 patient? If you could just open a second record quickly and take care of that and then not lose your place on the first one, would that be safer than perhaps losing your place on the first record because you could only have 1 open at a time and forgetting to enter an important order on that patient? So that would be the kind of example, and they come up fairly often where the preponderance of benefit over risk isn't as great as one would wish, and we always try to remember the safety engineer's dictum that this year's safety fix becomes next year's root cause.
If the decision is made that the hazard does need to be addressed and it's already in production, how urgent is the fix? Does it have to be done immediately? This is something that's really going to hurt people. We have to fix it now. More commonly, a month or even 6 months is adequate to fix something that hasn't reached any patients yet and might not while you're working it. And if it's not yet in production, perhaps you just delay implementing that application until you fix the problem. In terms of what steps need to be taken to fix the hazard, we asked here, what's the first step? Is it something the vendor can take care of? You're going to have to wait for an upgrade or a vendor patch. Is it something local IT can fix with a configuration change or custom programming? Is the only thing you can do right off the bat to train people, to train them away from the problem while you continue to work it? Or perhaps it's something that local IT training can help. And then how complete is that fix? And if it's not yet complete, what's the second step? So again, you would have these same options. And if the second step hasn't completely resolved it. Do you need a third step before it's really worked out of the system? So the first control step down near the bottom, and if it's still a partial fix, go ahead and enter another step. In terms of the control plan, who needs to approve the control plan? And that's the list on the left. And who's going to implement it? And that's the list on the right. And often they're the same departments are going to be involved in approving the control plan and in fixing it, but sometimes not. Sometimes you'll have several groups involved in figuring out what the fix should be and need to approve that everyone agrees that this is the right plan, and then perhaps just local IT is going to do the fix. So to tell you how we got here, that was version 2.0. I'd like to explain the test we did and our methods and some of the results and how we revised the Hazard Manager to get to version 2.0. So we had 7 study sites. They ranged from integrated delivery systems like Geisinger to single hospitals. We had urban and rural participants. We did individual interviews with them about usability of the tool. We had them enter some test scenarios, so they all entered the same 6 scenarios so we could see if they entered them the same way, and if they didn't, what their differences were. And we did cognitive testing as they were entering these scenarios. So they were talking aloud to us about their thinking as they entered them so we could understand how they were using the tool differently. We had a group conference about the items in the ontology, all those screenshots we just looked at, to see if people had suggestions for making them more comprehensive and mutually exclusive. We also talked about the usefulness of the reports, the automated reports in the Hazard Manager. And then we invited their vendors, all of our study sites' vendors, to take a look and give us feedback, and 4 of them did that and offered critiques. And we held a final meeting with the test sites, the vendors, and the federal agencies that were interested in this hazard issue, FDA, ONC, and AHRQ. We did a content analysis of those short descriptions, that very first free text field. We looked at the frequencies of hazards. So we had our test sites enter their own real hazards for about 6 months, and we got nearly 500 hazards in the test system, and we looked at the frequency of what they selected. So what kinds of things were checked together, what causal factors seemed to go together and which were never used. We looked at how they entered the test scenarios differently, and we got their suggestions for how to improve the ontology. And then you may have noticed there's an other specify in every one of the categories, and we did a content analysis of those as well.
So just a little bit of a caveat as we go forward. When we began this test, when we designed this test, we knew that the hazards that were entered would not be, we would not want to or be able to legitimately to interpret anything about the relative frequency of hazards or anything else. And we made it clear to the test sites that we would not be trying to interpret the hazards. What we were testing was the hazard manager, not their hazard identification. So, you know, all of the data are partial, they're non-representative. We hoped they would help us identify limitations with the hazard manager, but that's the only way they should be interpreted. Clearly, one of the things that happened was that many organizations used hazards that they had found months or maybe even years before the test to enter, and so obviously those are ones that stuck in people's mind for some reason. So just to sum up, that, and you see that last bullet, one organization actually had to have the hazards pre-approved by the legal department. So for a whole host of reasons, the content of the hazards is irrelevant. What we are grateful to the study sites for and what we paid attention to was what kinds of weaknesses with the hazard manager that these various hazards they were trying to enter would expose.
These are our 7 study sites, and you'll notice that on the right, one study site was not able to enter any hazards. This was our most resource-constrained study site, and although they did help with the inter-rater scenario testing and feedback and interviews, when it came to the time required to find hazards, investigate them enough to be able to fill out the hazard manager, it was just more than they were able to do. So we had 6 test sites that actually did enter hazards, and between them we had nearly 500. In terms of the kinds of the things that were checked most as to the hazards of, or the causes of hazards, you'll notice the 2 largest bars are usability and software design, and we'd like to talk about those a little more. So usability, one of the things we looked at for all the categories of causation was, did we see a lot of variation across the study sites? And in usability, we really did. We had one site, A, where they've used the same system for many years and customized it extensively and have worked through a lot of usability issues. So the share of their hazards that involved usability was fairly small. But sites C, D, and F, where they don't customize as much or don't have as many years of experience with their product, they had more usability, more hazards that had usability issues. Software design was also a frequent cause of hazards among the 500 in this test. And these were the attributes in the category of software design. So they ranged from faulty vendor implementation to inadequate clinical content, suboptimal interface between applications, that order entry and pharmacy system misalignment, faulty design, and other kinds of things related to software design. Faulty design turned out to be the most common causal attribute among all the hazards that were entered. It was present in 189 of the 495 hazards that folks entered. And of those, about 155, in addition to faulty design, something else was also entered. So something in combination with faulty design, and most often that was usability. So the combination of usability and faulty design was responsible for a lot of the hazards that were entered. Data quality was also fairly common in combination with faulty design. So we looked at that design category and we realized that the underlying attributes that we called out there were really too different and unrelated to be combined into one category. They really addressed several different things that were more properly grouped into other categories. We ended up eliminating the software design category altogether and redistributing the factors under it to the appropriate categories of usability and data quality and vendor factors. And then within the vendor factor category, we created one attribute of faulty software design specification in order to narrow the range of things that were attributed as faulty design. We also want to talk for a moment about other user factors, because this is where the second most commonly checked causal attribute arose, and that was user error. In the beta test version, it was called unforced user error. It was pretty clear in the interviews that people were confused by this concept of forced versus unforced, and were simply using the category user error. And they felt that about 79 of the 495 hazards had some element of user error, often in combination with something else, most often in combination with either usability or an organizational factor of some sort, like inadequate training for users. They erred because they weren't trained well. We also had one test scenario that directly addressed this user error issue. So using the example Dr. Walker just spoke to, this test scenario had a harried, busy physician, several patients' records open at once, and she placed an order on the wrong patient. So is that user error? We thought that all of our test sites would say yes, that's user error, but they didn't all feel that way. 5 of them checked user error, but the other 2 didn't. And they explained that they felt a sophisticated system would contain safeguards to confirm patient identity and prevent this kind of error, that it was the fault of the system, not the user, because users get tired and they make mistakes, and a really sophisticated system would protect them. This was a multi-check, so people could check as many different causes as they wished. And 3 of the 7 testers also felt that the software design was faulty for not having an identity confirmation step. And 3 also felt that the error was in part an issue of confusing information display, not being able to be absolutely clear which patient's chart they were looking at. So we revised the ontology and focused on the fact that user error was often due to the absence of protections or safeguards to prevent a user from erring. So in the decision support category, we added a new factor of missing recommendation or safeguard. So if the system had been smarter, what could it have done to prevent a user from making a mistake? And we redefined user error as use error in the absence of other factors. So when you've accounted for all the things about the software and its implementation and training and all the other things that could be done, there's still a small residual of people simply making mistakes. In terms of the overall categories under causation, on the left we have the beta test version, on the right we have version 2.0. Software design, as I said, is no longer present, and its attributes have been redistributed. Hardware, there were almost no hazards that had a hardware component, so it's just one factor now under other. After redefining some other elements, there weren't many things left under user factor and organizational factors, and they've all been combined into one kind of miscellaneous other factors category. In terms of the short hazard descriptions, we did a content analysis, and there really were only two patterns. The first, and it looks like the slide's missing a number 1, but the first is medication-related hazards, so things that were wrong in the dosing algorithms or formulary issues, things like that, all seem to be readily captured with the ontology. And the other was information associated with the wrong patient. So orders entered on the wrong patient, results routed to the wrong clinician, data stored in the system correctly but displayed for the wrong patient. Those three kinds of problems really have very different solutions. So we now have each of those called out separately in the ontology. The other thing we learned in working with these 7 test sites is that where you work really affects the kinds of hazards that you come across. So an IT implementation team that's very involved in specification and testing, they learn about hazards very early in the testing stage. A production team won't see the testing hazards. They'll see hazards that get into production and may compromise care. And the patient safety teams, and several of our sites were led by patient safety teams, they learn about care process compromises that reach patients, and especially those that cause harm. So if you're a patient safety team, you may not be aware of hazards that appear during testing. And if you're a testing team, you're working the hazards out before they ever harm anyone. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Jim to talk about some of the policy implications of this work.
So to return to the earlier topic, what is the value of the hazard manager for care delivery organizations? We believe that there are several. One could be that when an organization is preparing for an upgrade, it could be useful to see the patterns of hazards that other customers using that same product that they're upgrading to have experienced. We believe, obviously, that this could help improve patient safety by supporting proactive hazard control. And then third, one of the most important, but sometimes certainly hard to predict and sometimes hard to identify sets of hazards are those that occur at the interface of two products or two applications. And it seems that the hazard manager could give care delivery organizations insight into those sorts of hazards well in advance of when they would run into them themselves. And then next, very importantly, teams that do implementation and testing almost inevitably find more hazards that could be completely resolved. And one of the most important questions becomes, how important is it to resolve this, and what is the likelihood that this will ever cause anything? And if it does cause something, how likely is it to cause serious harm? Because organizations just have to be able to prioritize their limited resources for trying to address the most important hazards first. And so we believe that over time, use of the tool will enable organizations themselves and perhaps even cross-organizational learning about, how to estimate the likelihood that hazards will be dangerous earlier and more accurately. And then the next one is a very interesting one. Care delivery organizations told us that very often they have trouble really demonstrating to their vendors the seriousness of hazards that they've identified. And so it seems like the hazard manager might be a tool that user groups could use to prove or disprove, or at least strengthen or weaken the idea that a particular hazard deserved vendor attention. And then finally, obviously, our commitment is very deep that this kind of reporting system rarely works if all of the important players don't have their confidentiality well and visibly protected. It was great having the 4 vendors in the face-to-face meeting at the end of the project. And one of the things that they identified was that while they all have hazard identification systems and encourage their customers to bring hazards forward to them, in the nature of things, there's only so much attention that can be paid to these things, and that they felt that they would be able to learn about a lot of hazards that their customers don't currently raise with them, and be able to get a sense of how widespread or how widely impactful those hazards were. Again, we think that the vendors acted like one of the things that would be useful to them would be able to see which other companies' products in interaction with their products seem to be associated with hazards. Another thing, obviously, would be to let the vendor identify whether when I go to them with a hazard, it's just me, or if it's really something that may be more widespread than something idiosyncratic to one organization's setup. And then the next, everyone's experienced that when you go live or when you do an upgrade, there's this brief burst of new hazards that are identified. Obviously, it could be useful for vendors to be able to identify those quickly and try to address them before subsequent customers upgraded or went live. And then again, we think it's critically important that the vendors be able to count on confidentiality so that they can really support the system wholeheartedly. And then finally, policymakers would have, we think the tool would serve them in the sense that they could see some patterns about common hazards and perhaps get a better sense of how to fund research and where the most emphasis needs to be in terms of making systems safer. For the policymakers and everyone else, we believe that use of something like the Hazard Manager would enable us increasingly to identify hazards long before they're ever anywhere in a situation that they could harm a patient. And then if it were done carefully, we think the Hazard Manager reporting could help the whole sector know sort of what kind of progress we're making, probably first in identifying hazards and then over a longer period of time reducing the numbers certainly that reach patients. So just quickly on future deployment considerations for the Hazard Manager, we've designed it and done everything to make it publicly available. So that's the first thing to say. And one option would just be to provide it as is, to let PSOs or individual care delivery organizations or vendors or any other interested groups to use the Hazard Manager. That would obviously have some weaknesses. One is in number 2. One of the things that would make the Hazard Manager more useful to everyone, we believe, would be central ontology management, so that, for instance, as part of the common formats, so that the ontology was tested regularly, so there was an entity that received feedback from users and said, I couldn't document this or I don't understand that. and make it so that the hazard manager could be iteratively improved, but also kept standard so that everyone would still be using the same language to communicate with each other. Another step would be to aggregate hazards centrally. That would enable the fourth point, which would be hazard analysis. And we think that a SIAS, which was referenced in an earlier slide, is a really valuable sort of model here. On a budget of about $8 million a year, a SIAS receives hazard notifications from airlines, does analysis, and produces, I think it's about 200 reports a year. So you could imagine at least a centralized analysis service that could produce very, very valuable information at really very modest cost. And then number 6, obviously, there's the sort of policy question, who all is going to have their confidentiality protected and how carefully, and we've sort of touched on that before. And then number 7, information access. I mean, ideally, I think the database would be searchable by all stakeholders, and obviously, though, that depends on a number of the previous steps being executed. And then finally, one thing that would be more expensive than most of the rest of it would be, or might be, would be a securely brokered information request. So one of the weaknesses with having just that short description of the hazard is that a researcher or someone else who is trying to understand hazards better might want a lot more information about a hazard, and we believe that we could protect the confidentiality of people reporting hazards if someone who wanted more information about one or hazard or a set of hazards could send in a request to a central agency and say, I'd like more information on these hazards, and that agency could then confidentially send the request to whoever had sent in that report, say so-and-so would like to know more about this hazard, and then those organizations could decide whether to respond or not. So that, I think, is our presentation, and we would be, first of all, let you know that the final report is available on the ARC website, and then I think we'll be happy to entertain questions.
Thanks, Jim and Andrea. So I have a list of different questions that I've had kind of come through, and I'm going to start with before I start with a couple of them, I just wanted to remind our listeners that in about 2 weeks' time or so, this presentation will be available on ARC's NRC events page. And so, if there might have been something that you missed during today's presentation, you can go back there and go back through the presentation. And I've also had some people ask about, where's the hazard manager? Where can I get it? And as we were, I don't know if we might have jumped through the slide a little too quick. We're not releasing it yet. We're still in considering, as described by some of the deployment possibilities of what's the best way to deploy the hazard manager. We're working both internally here at ARC and as well as across our other federal sisters like ONC, et cetera, to kind of determine what might be the best approach for deploying the hazard manager, as well as also considering perhaps maybe another iteration of testing with more sites, et cetera. But stay tuned. We should hopefully have more information regarding that. So let me get to the questions. The first one is this tool intended for end users such as doctors or nurses?
Okay, great question. This is Jim. It's designed to be used by anyone who wants to use it. In our experience, most doctors and nurses just want to get on with their business, and we're lucky if they will send us a quick message about a possible hazard. But for a doctor or nurse who was interested in doing this, it absolutely is designed to be usable by them, and we've tried very hard in the language used and its brevity to make it the kind of thing that could be used by end users like doctors and nurses and patients and their lay caregivers, by the way, as well as by IT implementation and production support teams and safety teams.
Okay. We have someone else, a couple other individuals were wanting to know if maybe you could describe a little bit, maybe more in detail, the reporting capabilities of the hazard manager.
Yeah, right now the software has a search function where you can drill into any of the elements of the ontology and see the hazards that have that element. So if you're interested in looking at hazards that had user error or use error as one of their causes, you could drill into just see how many there were and get a list of them and look at them further. We've built a few, think of them as crosstabs, of the most high impact, most severe harm kinds of crosstabs. So cause and harm, and then severity of harm. We haven't built out a more sophisticated reporting yet. I think that is yet to come to find out what it is that people really want to be able to see reports on. And the software also needs probably one more upgrade phase in order to allow people to design their own crosstabs, so really doing custom reporting. Right now it's more of a drill down search, and it's half a dozen or so high impact crosstabs, but we know that users are going to have many different interests, and that's for I think version 3.0 we would build out the ability to do those custom reports.
Okay, we have a couple other questions that have come in kind of regarding, the potential for maybe a lawsuit or something as a result of using the hazard manager, if that data or information then would be susceptible to being part of having a lawsuit or something. Could you talk maybe about the patient safety organization protections on the data or the intention for having patient safety organization protection on the data and how it could be used without maybe perhaps, the organization or administration worrying about how the data might come back to haunt them if they reported patient harm?
Yeah, that's a very valid concern. During the beta test, the data collection was all operated under the auspices of the ECRI Patient Safety Organization, so it did have PSO protections. All of our study sites signed limited PSO agreements with ECRI. And when the test is over, we're going to destroy all the data. But the bigger question is in the future, how to give that same protection to anyone entering hazards. And I think there is, I think Jim and I agree that protection, the patient safety umbrella, probably is one of the best ways to roll out this tool so that organizations that are already reporting all other kinds of patient safety incidents to their PSOs could also report these kinds of hazards, and the PSOs could aggregate them just the way the common formats aggregate other kinds of patient safety incidents. But that's one very valid deployment option.
This is Jim. Just one other thought is it would be possible to use the hazard manager only for hazards that had not resulted in care process compromise. One of the truisms of safety engineering, and it's consistent with our experience, is that, and actually there's some publications in healthcare that suggest it's true also, that there are on the order of 300 to 500 hazards for every care process compromise, and on the order of 50 to maybe 100 care process compromises for every instance of patient harm. So the one possibility for an organization that was concerned about that issue would be to say we're only going to manage hazards that haven't caused any care process compromise or patient harm in the hazard manager, and we'll manage the others elsewhere. A better alternative, obviously, would be to be under patient safety organization protection.
Thanks. Let's see, we have another question. How does this differ from other incident reporting systems, perhaps like EHR Event?
In a couple of ways. It's not easy to tell how EHR Event was created, but one of the things about the Hazard Manager is that all of the categories and features come out of the experiences of care delivery organizations, both Geisinger in the alpha test and these 6 sites in the beta test, actually trying to manage hazards. There are also some characteristics of EHR Event that would be problematic. One, I'm sorry, I forget the question, but there's one question in EHR Event that has 4 different categories in it. So it's something like, was there a problem with usability, data quality, something else, or something else? So that, an answer of yes to that, anyone trying to analyze it wouldn't know which of the 4 or 5 things subsumed in that one question it actually had been. So, we've first of all, the Hazard Manager is based on care delivery organization experience with this and vendor feedback, and also trying hard to make sure that the ontology and the elements in the ontology really are comprehensive, unambiguous, mutually exclusive, represent significant forms of hazard, those sorts of things.
I think the other difference is that EHR Event is exactly what it sounds like. It's about events that have taken place, real incidents. What we're aiming for here is getting earlier and earlier in the life cycle, so in a really proactive sense, you're intercepting hazards before there can be an event. So I think what we're aiming for is something well upstream of incidents that would be reported through EHR Event.
So to put it maybe too vividly, if you're buying a lawnmower, you probably want to buy it from a company who has tried to make it safe, not waited to see if someone cuts their toe off with it or not.
Thanks for the lawnmower analogy, Jim. Someone wanted to know how long does it take on average to enter a report with the different various parts, and I'm not sure if we collected that information, but I know we talked about it at the meeting. Would you want to talk about the length of entering for filling out the reports?
Yeah, probably our most adept user said it took him about 5 minutes per hazard, and he got very fast. The others said it's not so much the time to enter, click the buttons, it's more a question of doing the background investigation to have the answers to all those questions. So it could take 10 minutes, 30 minutes to track down all the information, and much less than that to enter it. So part of the question really is how much investigation do you need to go through in order to be able to answer the questions in the Hazard Manager.
And that raises another good point. The Hazard Manager is designed to let people work the way they work. So, a production support person might get a call from someone and say, I couldn't order amoxicillin in this screen. And, they may not have any time at all to figure out all of the details, but they can open the hazard, they can put in as much as they know, and then part of the way it's designed is that someone else who has more time, and maybe it's their role in the organization, can do a more thorough analysis and update the hazard. So it isn't as if you have to know everything to put the hazard in. And you may never know everything.
Okay, we have some more questions rolling in. Someone wanted to know, and I know that we talked about this, maybe you can let the individuals know that as you're on the actual Hazard Manager software, that we have pop-up boxes for some of the different levels, so that way people who might not be familiar with a term can understand it or know what the definition is or the criteria. Did you want to talk about perhaps the different terminology and how you decided or selected to make sure that the end user knows exactly what it is you're looking for?
Yeah, that's a good question, too. There were some terms, many terms, that were widely understood without any difficulty by the IT production teams, by patient safety teams. Everyone had a common understanding, and we didn't feel any need to put all of those in a glossary. There were other terms that either were unfamiliar to the patient safety folks or to the IT folks, or where we saw enough difference of understanding that we felt it was important to define them. So there's a couple of dozen terms that met those criteria, and we do have a kind of partial glossary to define the terms that were not universally understood by our test sites.
And just for a footnote, and many of them that the sites identified, we just changed the term, and some of them we still define, but that's one of the ways the sites were very, very useful to call out several terms that just needed to be completely changed.
Someone wants to know if it would be possible to maybe give some examples of data quality hazards. And maybe to tie that in, because I see another...
One, this may not be quite, but I think it's at least maybe suggestive. When you're documenting immunizations, if there were no place in an EHR to record the lot number, for instance, then, and I know of no EHR where this is true, just to make it clear, but if that were the case, then that would be a situation where the limitations of the system would make it so that the data wouldn't let you identify everybody who got a bad lot of a vaccine and revaccinate them. That's the sort of thing that we're talking about. I guess another might be, with lab tests, take a glucose. You can have point-of-care glucose machines. You can have the labs glucose. You can have, I guess our organization must have 15 different sources of glucoses. Some of them are strictly comparable, and some of them may have much wider or different normal ranges or be much less reliable. And so that's an important issue. And so you could imagine a situation, if that wasn't well managed, where a clinician was acting on information that was not nearly as accurate as they might have thought it would be. I'm sorry, I'm not coming up with others, but that kind of thing where the information looks, rock solid to a user, but perhaps it is not high quality for one reason or another.
Very well. What about, let's see, we have a few more questions here, and I'm seeing if I can maybe combine a couple. Let's see. With usability and software design being high on the list in the beta version, is there data being generated on the depth of site training and end-user input during development and how that correlates to hazards? I don't recall that it was, but would you like to maybe talk about that?
Well, that wasn't collected. It's not collected in the hazard manager directly, how much training there is. But that is one of the ways we envisage the hazard manager being used, is that if an organization saw, for instance, that they had a lot of usability problems, and then they responded to that by saying, okay, we're going to go through our whole system and identify everything that people have trouble understanding using the hazards identified in the hazard manager, and try to fix those, and then watch the rate of the report of usability issues over time. That would not be, there would be limitations to that data, but we still think that many organizations might find it a useful estimate of how they're doing with that kind of initiative.
Okay. Let's see, and someone has asked if that hazard manager would be able to be integrated to perhaps an EHR, EMR, CPOE, or if it is a separate system. And so far as envisioned, this would be a separate system, but maybe if you had the ability to do whatever you would like you like to see this perhaps being integrated into a certain system someday, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've tried to design it. I mean, we felt that it made sense to have a software tool that the usability of it had been tested, but we would welcome organizations, EHR vendors or anybody else, taking the elements of the hazard manager and basically hiding them in some other application. So, a PSO might just build them into their, sort of reporting system, and, it might not be visible as hazard manager, but it would be part of the way an organization could capture all of the different kinds of hazards that they do. Vendors the same way. If a vendor put it into either their EHR system or their dedicated, production, implementation, testing, production support software that they give to local IT, we would welcome that.
Okay. Let's see. Do you know why the participating test sites only submitted a small number of hazards that they did? Was the absence of hazards, or is it that they just were too busy perhaps focusing on the day-to-day clinical issues of providing care, et cetera? And could you maybe describe a little bit more in depth about the different sites and the hazards that they were entering?
Sure. We asked each of our study sites to try to enter 100 hazards over the course of 6 months, and most of them did. They were getting essentially no compensation for this. It was taking time away from their day jobs. So we were grateful to get the 500 hazards we did. And I'm not sure our results would have been any different if we'd had 800 hazards. I think we had a big enough of a critical mass to see where the issues were in the ontology and in the usability of the tool in this scale of test. In terms of the study sites, we had a couple of large integrated delivery systems. We had some solo hospitals, including a children's hospital. We had one site that wasn't able to enter any hazards, although they did participate in the rest of the test. So, and then we had a couple of multi-hospital, kind of urban academic multi-hospital systems. So it really ran the gamut, and the number of hazards was not related to the size of the organization at all. We had study sites. Some of our participants were patient safety teams, and some were production teams. So we got rather different types of hazards depending on who was involved at the health system.
And for people who remember that slide, there was one organization that only submitted 20. At that organization, legal had to approve any hazards that they entered. So that was the reason their number was small. Part of the testable hypothesis about the hazard manager is that if people had a usable tool, we believe many organizations would capture a lot more hazards than they do now, because of the pressures of just keeping the business running. If there's no convenient way to enter them, and particularly to manage them, sort of say, show me all the hazards that are supposed to be acted on this month, which is one of the reports that is available, so you can sort of make sure that you don't let hazards that you think are on the road to resolution get away from you. We believe that a usable, and our experience at least is that having a place to put hazards once you identify them is an important part of building the culture that says we're going to look for hazards and find them and root them out before they ever touch anybody.
Thanks, Jim. I think also, I just want to speak to that as part of kind of the process of working through the Hazard Manager project, and when the sites were able to come together, not just the sites, but the vendors, was this developing a culture, as you said, for really for health IT safety, and as well as making sure that the systems are best aligned, making sure that sites are best ready for perhaps if it's a system upgrade, or if they have two different systems that are interfaced with each other. And as well as, I think one of the values of the hazard manager is to start thinking about those things in a prospective manner as opposed to retrospectively. Do you think maybe you could talk a little bit more about that kind of value with the hazard manager?
Yeah, in fact, it's anecdotal, but one of the exciting things about this whole project was that many of the study sites really were excited at the ability to have a place to put them, to sort of have a nexus or a prompt for emphasizing the importance of capturing hazards. I'm not sure anyone said this directly, but I get the sense that it was valuable as a concrete way of saying to all of the people on these teams, look, this really is important to us, so important that we're willing to spend time with this, and at least several of the study sites have said, we want to keep using the tool in whatever form it exists after this is over.
We've got a few other questions that have come in, and I know that from this standpoint, I guess I'll phrase the question in this way to maybe try to answer a group of questions. Is it possible for the hazard manager in the future to maybe consider the billing aspect of health IT?
Yeah, that's something you could probably tell from my expostulation there. Is something that we, had not really focused on, but yes, that makes perfect sense. Obviously, there's considerable opportunity for error, particularly when you automate the move from documentation in EHR to dropping a bill. Absolutely, that's a great point, whoever asked that. For us, it's slightly less important because it wouldn't kill anybody, but that doesn't mean it's not important.
We have someone else who has asked a question, and it deals, I think, directly, with Geisinger, since you have your own integrated both systems and health plan, and whether, and how would the hazard manager, would that be impacted by, for instance, an entity such as Geisinger Health System that have such an integrated system, and how might the hazard manager, help you with the connection across all of those different systems?
Yeah, that's a great question, and clearly one of the things that was really over the horizon when we started developing the hazard manager, but makes it more and more to the point, I think, is that if we're going to do real care coordination, if we're really going to run accountable care arrangements, some of them ACOs, the interfaces and the sharing of information from one context to another context where it may not mean exactly the same thing, and it may not be clear that there's been some change in meaning because of the change in context. The possibility of introducing errors, and back to that earlier question, data quality errors will be one of the biggest swords, I think, makes this effort to really test systems and to capture sort of characteristic places that trouble crops up I think that's one of the reasons that the hazard manager could be useful. Same thing with health information exchange. Clearly, when you bring just something as simple, relatively simple, as bringing lab results from across a region into one setting, we worked very hard to make sure that the original meaning is indicated, but that takes a lot of work, and there's certainly potential for getting that wrong.
All right. Well, I think that's going to do it from my end. But Jim and Andrew, if you would like to say any final thoughts before we turn it back over.
Oh, just thank you very much for joining us and staying on.
All right. Terrific. Well, I think that'll do it this afternoon for us, and for some of you, perhaps late morning. Again, thank you for joining us today, and have a good rest of the week. And again, go to the Health IT website to download your copy of the Hazard Manager Final Report. Thanks.